Chapter 5 Part 1 of 2. Topics in Chapter 5. Admitted to the bar. Opposes a coercive bankrupt law. The Glentworth election frauds. Law book purchases. Death of Elam Tilden. A winter's journey from Albany. The Know-Nothing cyclone. James K. Polk elected president. Silas Wright governor of New York. The Daily News established. The slavery schism in the Democratic Party. Elected to the Assembly. The Anti-Rent War. Elected to the Constitutional Convention of 1846. At the May term of the Supreme Court in 1841, Tilden was admitted to the bar and immediately opened an office at number 11 Pine Street in the city of New York. From that day forth he ceased to be a burden to his parents, and though his clients were not numerous, nor his business very lucrative, he had been accustomed to live so inexpensively that he managed to bring his expenses at once within his income, a habit which he maintained through life. His business was not yet so engrossing, however, as to withdraw his attention from public affairs. Before President William Henry Harrison had been inaugurated, his ardent partisans threatened to improve the first days of the approaching session of Congress not only in rechartering the United States Bank, but in conferring upon it a charter which Congress should have no power to repeal. Mr. Tilden made the unsoundness and absurdity of such an attempt on the part of Congress to disable itself the theme of an article of some 17 pages in the Democratic Review for August, 1841. His argument has never been answered, nor has the action of Congress in repealing the charter ever been reversed. He was also a speaker at a public meeting in New York of those opposed to a coercive bankrupt law, and conducted a protracted and somewhat acrimonious contest in the Evening Post with the Whig press in reference to the part which the collector of the port, Mr. Edward Curtis, had taken in procuring or conniving at the introduction of citizens from a neighboring city to vote at the then recent presidential election. The frauds were engineered by an adventurer of the name of James B. Glentworth. It is to this affair that allusion is made in a letter to his father, dated January 20, 1842. I sent 2 of the Glentworth pamphlets to you and 1 to Mr. Younglove immediately on receiving Henry's letter. Can it be that you have not received them? I think I will send another. You will have seen that the papers do now make extracts from the pamphlet. Mr. Bryant and I have kept up a hot fire on Curtis. There was a concerted design not to answer, and to whistle down the whole matter, but we forced them to speak. The first and second long articles were mine, except the 2 concluding lines of each. The third, Mr. Bryant's. The 2 or 3 short ones mostly mine. The first answer to the American, and the concluding reply, except its first 2 paragraphs. I would not have been drawn into the matter except at the urgent solicitation of Mr. Bryant, and under the strong indignation I felt at the course of proceedings, commencing with the charge of conspiracy, and ending with the removal of Morris. I hope we are now done with C, but we may be obliged to reply once more. The understanding is that the others shall receive justice at different hands than mine. These articles have made a great sensation, and regarded by our people as triumphant, and by some of the Whigs as satisfactory. The Whig press has been exceedingly troubled. The steadiness and perseverance of the attacks, the concentration of them on a single point until the public attention was thoroughly arrested, and the successful avoidance, so far, of all false issues, have annoyed them amazingly. The 3 last were written in great haste, nearly the whole of each, after I got down to the office of the Post, and before the paper went to press at 12 or 1. If, as is very likely, I am found out by Curtis, I shall have made one warm friend. I am, on the whole, better than for several winters before, though on the day that I made the speech at the bankrupt meeting I was in committee all the evening, and kept up late by Mr. Ward's business. I was fagged, and the next night was at a party at Mr. Butler's, and then editing the post, I became a little worn. All that is now done, and I am in the usual train again. There were no law institutes nor law libraries accessible to the young lawyer in those days, and it was necessary for him to purchase such books as he required or go without them. The investment of a few $100s in books, therefore, was the first expense for which he had to provide in those days after he had paid for his shingle. Tilden had opened his office but a few months when he felt that, with a little assistance from his father, he could afford to strengthen this branch of his office equipment. Of the way he set about it we have some curious glimpses in the following letter. Tilden to his father. New York, February 7, 1842. My dear father, I went the other night to an auction of law books to pick up a few little things. Whether because of the rain, or from mere accident, probably from the season of the year in which there are few competitors, I found the New York report selling at about 25% lower than the lowest auction prices. I bought Wendell, 25 volumes, Coing, 9 volumes, Page, 7 volumes, and Johnson, 20 volumes, which, with a few I have already, comprise the reports of the state, except some half a dozen less important ones which I allowed an acquaintance to take at a very low price. These works are in higher demand, and usually bring nearer the bookstore price than any other books, and they are the most indispensable. I have attended all the auctions for some years, and I give a schedule of comparative prices. I never knew more than one set would sell at these low prices at the same time. Of course the books are, some of them, soiled. I should not have bought them just now if the chance had not been one which ought not to be allowed to pass. I believe that I could take at least $50 from the bookseller for my purchase. Nevertheless, I am extremely reluctant to lay out so much money in these times, between $190 and $200, and I wanted to pay up what I had drawn from Pinco rather than draw more. He is in so easy a condition that it will produce not the least inconvenience. One half, or nearly, I think I can reimburse during the next 2 days. There was $20 on an oat I gave him from Marin, and I yesterday got another, of $60 having 30 days to run. I shall try the harder to get it out of Aaron, which I may do by taking and collecting notes. He seems disposed to pay as fast as he can, but is much embarrassed. I expect $15 or $20 this week of my professional earnings, though I have to advance for costs and have expenses to pay incident to commencing in business. Still I should like $100 if you have it to spare. If you have not, but can ream a penny, current funds to Peter Lyon deposit without use, to keep up the bank account, it would be very well. I may need a little more help, but I will do with as little as I can. This moving may make it necessary for me to have bookcases a little sooner than I otherwise should. I am as well as common. I have nothing to do with politics except in the time I was helping the post, which was a special exception. Otherwise I meddle no more than is compatible with, if not conducive to, professional success. On the 10th of April of this year Samuel Tilden's father died. Of this event there is no trace in his correspondence, except that his domestic letters in future were addressed uniformly to his mother. This event threw the young barrister, more than ever before, upon his own resources, for, till now, the father had been not only his confidant in everything, but his advice seems to have been sought and given in reference to every detail of the son's life with a freedom and fullness very unusual even in the most united families. Mr. Elam Tilden was a man of enlarged views, of excellent judgment, of pure character, a devoted father and husband, and naturally enjoyed great personal authority with his neighbors. He had always taken an active interest in politics, but not for its rewards. He was at one time postmaster at New Lebanon, and was several times elected as supervisor, but, with abundant influence at Albany and at Washington, he never was a candidate for any office either of honor or of profit. a feature of his character which no doubt contributed largely to beget the great respect always shown for his views by many of the leading statesmen of his party. Only a few months before his death he received a letter from Senator Wright of such pathetic interest that we need offer no apology for inserting it here. It is in reply to a letter Elam Tilden had written to President Van Buren, suggesting the nomination of Mr. Wright for governor. Silas Wait to Elam Tilden. Washington, the 3rd of July 1840. My dear sir, the President did me the favor to give me, last evening, the perusal of a letter from you to him, and inasmuch as my name was mentioned in it too kindly, I feel bound to improve a moment of leisure to write to you upon the subject. I have been long since advised that some of my too partial friends have felt an anxiety that my name shall be placed before the people of the state as a candidate for the office of governor. It would be as unnatural as it would be unjust that I should not acknowledge my grateful feelings towards those who have manifested this high sense of my capabilities, and it pains me to be compelled to declare that I am conscious my friends have overrated me in this instance. I further verily believe that, at the present time, and in the present state of the public mind in certain portions of our state, I should not be as strong a candidate for this important office as many others who are named as candidates. I have not time, however, to discuss this last question with you, even if it would be proper for me to do it, and I certainly cannot discuss the question of my own capacity and qualifications. There are other reasons, however, of a private character, which forbid that I should be a candidate for governor, and those I am bound to give to my friends, and I give them to you with the fullest confidence that your fair mind will appreciate them. I have been, as you know, in public life almost since I became a man of business at all. I was not worth $500 in the world when I was elected to the Senate of our state in the fall of 1823. You know what has been my life since, and what has been my compensation in the various and very honorable and responsible situations I have held. I need scarcely say to you that I have really had no private business during the whole period, and my opportunities to make property, therefore, have been merely those which my official compensations have placed in my way. I have lived prudently, or endeavored to do so, and I consider myself now worth about $8,000. Located where I am, and pursuing the style of living which I have always preserved, and having no family but my wife, and owing no debts, I am quite independent. But make me governor, and it will require from $5,000 to $6,000 to furnish a house for that officer in a manner due to the office, an expense which I cannot defray without going in debt to 3/4 of the amount. I know from Governor Marcy that the salary, with great prudence, will just about defray the expenses of the governor's house for the term, and cannot be made to do more, the rent being paid by the state. At the close of the term, then, all my property, very nearly, if not entirely, would consist of worn furniture for which I should have no use, and I should be left without other means, not to live in the quiet and retired manner I heretofore have, and now do, but to support the standing of an ex-governor of New York. In other words, I should be left a political pauper, a character which it has been the most anxious effort of my life to avoid. This is one of my reasons. The second is not less strong. My wife was taken from the country, has been bred up and always lived there, and is most exceedingly averse to being placed in any situation which shall require from her the discharge of duties to which she does not consider herself fitted either by education, habit, or feeling. Indeed, I say no more than the truth to you when I say to you that she is made unhappy by the slightest agitation of this question. She is a good and faithful wife to me, and I cannot, even for the sake of my political party, make her unhappy. Now, my good sir, I confess that I owe to my political friends everything which a man can owe, but do I owe it to them to incur either of these consequences, much more both of them? I cannot think so. Please consider this letter private, except the conclusion declared, which is not private, and if you think I am wrong, say so to me with your accustomed frankness. As I have been compelled to finish this letter in my seat, and in the midst of the transaction of business, you must pardon errors, and believe me. Most respectfully and truly yours, Silas Wright, Jr. Elam, Tilden, Esq. There is little doubt that the financial inconveniences of his accepting the office of governor, set forth with such simple pathos by Senator Wright, contributed not a little towards preparing the public mind for the provision subsequently made for an executive residence at the state capitol, of which, by a curious coincidence, the son of Mr. Wright's correspondent was the first official occupant. In the spring of 1843 business took Tilden to Albany. The account which he gave his mother of his journey homeward makes it difficult for the people of this generation to realize that scarce half a century has elapsed since the political capital of the state of New York was as remote from its commercial capital at certain seasons of the year as New Orleans is today. Tilden to his mother. New York, March 27, 1843. Monday morning. My dear mother, having tried the experiment in several ways, I am pretty well convinced that it is almost 3 days' journey to this city. The weather at some times, and my business at others, delaying me in Albany till then. I started at 4:12 a.m. on last Thursday morning. Passing the New York line in a slight snow squall, we reached Cornwall, Connecticut, at 11 o'clock. The conductor instantly omitted to put on the snow plows which were deposited at Barrington, and, having been retarded by the snow, our fuel and water were exhausted, and the locomotive obliged to leave the cars and go down to Kent, 6 miles, to recruit. This done, it could not back up, and was forced to go on 18 miles to Milford and turn around, the snow meanwhile falling very rapidly. In the afternoon I tried to get up a party to go in a double sleigh to Kent, but so confident were all of a return of the locomotive that night, and so apprehensive of being left, that I was unsuccessful until late in the evening, when I determined to go, if alone, and a number joined the expedition. We went 3 miles, to a little house situated upon the railroad, instead, as we should have done, to the village 3 or 4 miles farther. Between that and midnight some 25 or 30 followed. Our house was a very small, mean, and dilapidated one. We put the ladies in the principal room, the old men in what pretended to be beds in the garret, and 20 of us reposed on the floor of the kitchen, very small, and by no means the cleanest. We spread upon the floor the remnant of a straw bed and an old coverlet, and on these the luckiest of us got our heads and shoulders, while some curled themselves in the corners, and others got upon the chairs, which straddled over the legs of the under tier. 3 times I tried to turn over, but could only accomplish it by getting up and lying down anew. Several of the gentlemen helping to cook, we breakfasted on ham and eggs, and a few of us slept for Kent. About 9 the locomotive came up in company, with 2 others attached to the upward train, but it was wrong end foremost, and had to go up 24 miles to North Canong to turn around. At about 9 in the evening it returned, but before it could safely start had to send on an express to prevent meeting the next upward train. We had all come down to the cars, but the locomotive going on to break the way. Some of us returned to the hotel, and, after much debate, 2 or 3 of us lay down, myself with boots, overshoes, and all on. Before midnight we learned that the obstructions were so great, that those who could get a place to lie on ventured to undress a little more. About 9 or 10 the next morning we started on, getting to Bridgeport in the afternoon, and, after having been aground in the harbor for an hour, got to sea, arriving in New York between 8 and 9 Saturday evening. You complained that you did not have a history of my last expedition, so I have given this. I'd rust with sufficient minuteness. I took no cold, and am at least as well as when I started. When I saw Mr. Van Buren he told me he understood that there was to be a marriage at our house, that General Good told him. I was so uncertain whose secret he had been disclosing, that, lest I should betray another, I said very little. Affectionately yours, S.J. Tilden. At the New York charter election in the spring of 1844, both the old parties were thrown into confusion and driven from the field by a third party, which appeared with the suddenness and the force of a tropical cyclone and swept the country. The prodigious impulse which had been given to immigration by recent legislation, the increased competition with the labor of the country which it created, the consequent reduction of wages, and the simultaneous effort to exclude the use of the Bible from the public schools in the interest of what was then regarded as practically an alien ecclesiasticism, awakened a feeling in the country which, with an almost incredible rapidity, crystallized into what is now known to history, sometimes as the Native American, and sometimes as the Know-Nothing Party. The Whigs had nominated Morris Franklin for mayor, the Democrats nominated Mr. Coddington, and the Native Americans nominated Mr. Harper, of the well-known publishing firm of Harper and Brothers. Mr. Harper, who was a Methodist, was elected over both of the other candidates, as the Native Americans professed neutrality in politics, and to have no purpose in their organization but to resist the encroaching influence of aliens in our affairs and to prevent their appropriating too large a proportion of the local offices. The question of paramount interest that now began to agitate the old parties was, which will be able to absorb the largest share of the Native American vote at the presidential election that was to be held in the fall of that year. To the great disappointment and disgust of the friends of Mr. Van Buren, who were counting upon his renomination, he was defeated in the National Democratic Convention, and James K. Polk, of Tennessee, received the nomination. The feeling that this defeat had been brought about by what in sporting circles is termed a foul blow. Van Buren's friends in the state convention had offended the slave proprietors by instructing their representatives in Congress to resist the formation of 5 new slave states out of Texas, had so chilled the Democrats of New York that for a time the defeat of the ticket was regarded as inevitable. The men who for years had led the party with distinction, Van Buren, Wright, Flagg, Young, and the younger generation who had been trained in their ranks, found themselves, by Van Buren's defeat, and the means by which it was accomplished, suddenly landed outside of the party. The only alternatives left to them seemed to be revolt, or the cod and forks. Mr. Tilden had by this time become one of the recognized forces of the party, not only in New York, but in Washington. He saw that revolt was ruin to Mr. Van Buren's friends, and their only hope was in making Mr. Polk owe to them his election, by giving to him the electoral vote of New York. To accomplish this result it was necessary in the first place to nominate Senator Wright for governor. There was no other man in the party who could be confidently counted upon to carry the state, and with him the governorship was comparatively certain even if the electoral ticket failed. It was a great struggle for Mr. Wright to leave his seat in the Senate, where he had become a national power. He had refused the nomination to the vice presidency on the ticket with Polk, which was offered him, and accepted the governorship, subject to all the objectionable conditions so frankly set forth in his letter to Father Tilden 4 years before. No one individual had more influence in persuading Mr. Wright to this sacrifice than Mr. Tilden, as no one probably, more justly than he, appreciated the magnitude of that sacrifice. To prove that, in spite of the ill treatment, Mr. Van Buren's friends were loyal to the party, that President Polk would owe his election not only to the democracy of New York, but to the friends of the candidate who had been wronged, to prevent the success of Mr. Clay, the Whig candidate, to discourage a reactionary agitation against the financial policy of the Democratic Party, and finally, whatever might befall the national ticket, to retain political control of the Empire State. These were the considerations which were pressed upon Mr. Wright to accept the nomination, and to which, to his incalculable personal discomfort, he finally yielded. Once nominated, it was desirable that the vote of New York should be not only sufficient but significant. It was now Mr. Tilden's turn to make sacrifices. His party had not the support of a single daily morning paper in New York City of any influence or repute. To recover and bring back to the party as many as possible of those who had been seduced from it into the Native American organization rendered a medium for reaching and reasoning with this class of the first importance. Mr. Tilden by his speeches and writings had established such relations with the wage-earning class, from which the Native American Party was largely recruited, and he enjoyed their confidence to a so much larger extent than any other prominent Democrat in New York City, that he was urged from all sides to meet the needs of the party by establishing a paper himself. As no one appreciated the need of such a medium of communicating with the public more than he, so no one better than he knew how rare at that time were the men who would not do more harm than good with such an instrument. He probably would not have seriously entertained the idea of adding to his professional cares, which were rapidly increasing, by undertaking the administration and pecuniary risks of a daily newspaper, if he had not been promised the cooperation of John L. O'Sullivan, the editor of the Democratic Review, an accomplished scholar and a ready writer, who was very anxious to connect himself with the daily press, but who had neither the means nor the political influence to warrant him in attempting to found a new paper alone. After some weeks of deliberation and daily debate, the foundations were laid of the Morning News. It was conducted on the lines laid down by Mr. Tilden, and with so much vigor and enterprise, as newspaper enterprise was reckoned in those days, that it was no uncommon thing to hear the success of the Democratic ticket in 1844 attributed to its agency. Nor was there probably much, if any, exaggeration in this statement, for without some such unequivocal and daily testimony of the desire of Mr. Van Buren's friends for the success of the ticket, there is little doubt that Mr. Clay, who was a popular man in New York, would have been elected over Mr. Polk, who, when nominated, had probably never been heard of by 100 Democrats in the state. As it was, Mr. Polk's plurality over Clay in New York State was a little over 5,000, while Wright's majority over Fillmore, the Whig candidate for governor, was 10,033. Thus far all the objects contemplated by Mr. Tilden in the nomination of Senator Wright for governor and in founding his newspaper had been realized. President Polk had been elected, and by so narrow a majority as to show that even lukewarmness on the part of Mr. Van Buren's friends must have resulted in his defeat. Mr. Wright's majority also, almost double that of the President, was evidence, not to be questioned, of the greater strength of Mr. Van Buren than of Mr. Polk in the state. Having now no longer any use for a newspaper, Mr. Tilden, soon after the election, presented his interest in the Morning News to Mr. O'Sullivan, and retired from the firm to the more profitable duties of his profession. We have said that thus far he had accomplished all the objects which he had in view in starting the newspaper, but he was very far from having accomplished the ultimate object of that enterprise. He had not anticipated that the surprising popularity of Mr. Wright, and the views he entertained in regard to the increase of slave representation in Congress by the carving of a bunch of slave states out of Texas, would have precisely the contrary effect to that upon which he was counting, and would unite the South with the time-serving politicians of the North at once into a compact combination to destroy him and to disorganize the party in New York, of which he was, since the retirement of Mr. Van Buren, the most conspicuous member. He did not yet realize how much more importance the statesmen of the South attached to strengthening the entrenchments of slavery than to any other measure of public policy then engaging the attention of the country. He was not long, however, in being enlightened. The federal appointments in New York showed gratitude as usual in politics only for favors to come. Mr. Marcy, who led the column of recusancy, was appointed Minister of War. The effort was made to seduce Tilden from his allegiance to his friends in New York by the offer of the naval office, then a lucrative and honorable position. To most men this would have been a temptation. Tilden had but just completed his 31st year. The emoluments of the office were some $20,000 a year, and the labor and responsibility inconsiderable. Tilden was poor, and many years must elapse before he could hope for any such a revenue from his profession. The offer, however, did not tempt him. He promptly declined it, saying that he did not labor for the election of President Polk to push his own interests, that when he was admitted to the bar he resolved that he would hold no merely lucrative office, and that, if he took any, it must be in the line of his profession or a post of honor, but under the then existing circumstances he could accept of nothing. From this time forth there were practically two Democratic parties, so called, in the state of New York, one led by William L. Marcy, and vulgarly known sometimes as hard shells, and sometimes as hunkers, who were either in favor of or not opposed to the extension of slavery into the free territories from which it had been excluded by the Ordinance of 1789, and the other led by Silas Wright while he lived, also vulgarly known sometimes as the soft shells, and sometimes as barn burners, who were opposed to the extension of slavery into those territories. Though the division lines of these parties, like those of latitude and longitude, were not visible to the eye, nor the parties themselves sufficiently organized to occupy hostile camps, the end towards which they were severally working were quite as distinct as if they were. The logic of the situation required Mr. Wright to be re-elected governor, and to succeed President Polk in 1848, or retire from public life, and Mr. Marcy to defeat Mr. Wright's re-election as governor, or himself retire from public life. It was practically to engage in such a duel that Mr. Wright went to Albany and took the oath of office on the 1st of January, 1845. He had in his favor a great parliamentary reputation, and a character for wisdom, probity, and political sagacity, enjoyed in a superior degree by no other American statesman of his generation. On the other hand, he had to contend with an administration in whose eyes all these virtues, when enlisted against slavery, were regarded only as so many additional reasons for crushing their possessor. He had also to contend with a very considerable number who still called themselves Democrats, but who had deserted the party from mistrust of the success of its financial policy, and who were impatient to recover some sort of party standing. The odds were largely against Governor Wright, and no one knew it better than he when he took his seat in the governor's chair at Albany. It was therefore at his special instance that Mr. Tilden accepted a nomination and an election to the state legislature which convened on the 1st of January, 1846. Though this was Tilden's first experience in any legislative body, his colleagues were not long in discovering his value. The most conspicuous service that he rendered in that body probably was the part he had in adjusting a controversy between certain landlords and their tenants, which had become so flagrant as not only to disturb the public peace of several counties in the state, but which had a more or less controlling and unhappy influence upon its party organizations. A very considerable portion of the land in several counties of the state of New York were held under titles conferred before the Revolution of 1776, and carrying with them important manorial and feudal privileges. These lands were let by the proprietors upon perpetual leases, the rent payable in products of the soil, poultry, and personal service, all mill privileges, mines, right-of-way, and sundry other incidental advantages being reserved by the proprietors. As the state became more populous, these lands and their products became more valuable, and the pernicious character of these tenures more and more oppressive to the tenants. Upon the death, in 1839, of Stephen Van Rensselaer, of Albany, one of the largest land proprietors in the state, his holdings comprised a tract some 24 miles long and 48 miles broad. His tenants were in arrears for their rent nearly $400,000. Attempts to collect these rents were forcibly and successfully resisted. Armed patrols were established which, aided by the adoption of various disguises, enabled the tenants successfully to defy the civil authorities. The militia were called upon to reinforce the civil authorities. This provoked the tenants to the organization of what were called anti-rent clubs throughout the manorial districts, with the view of acquiring a controlling influence in the legislature. Small bands, disguised as Indians and well-armed, were organized and kept in readiness to resist the officers of the law whenever they attempted to serve the tenants with legal process. These bands guarded all the roads through the manorial territory so effectually that it finally became unsafe anyone not an anti-renter to be found anywhere within their lines. Mr. Tilden encountered a formidable body of them among his colleagues in the legislature. Their grievances could not be wholly denied. Still less could the means to which they had resorted for redress be tolerated. The situation was beset with difficulties. The subject was treated at great length in the governor's message, and at an early stage of the session was referred to a special committee, of which Mr. Tilden, who was a native of one of the manorial counties, was made the chairman. His report formed the basis of the legislation adopted before the close of the session, which promptly and completely extinguished an element of discontent that had persistently disturbed the public peace, often to the verge of flagrant war, for nearly a century. While a member of the Assembly, Mr. Tilden was elected to the convention called to revise the state constitution in the summer of 1846. In this body he devoted his attention more especially to questions of finance and the canals, the two subjects about which the average state legislator has least knowledge, and with which, both by his lack of training and experience, he is least competent to deal. No one times, with perhaps the single exception of Michael Hoffman, had more to do with shaping the provisions of the Constitution finally adopted, relating to the management of the canals, than Mr. Tilden. He was also chairman of the Select Committee on Corporations, and reported the provision which requires corporations to be formed under general laws, instead of special acts, and which reserved to the legislature the right to alter or repeal their charter, at its discretion. The late Charles O'Connor, who was also a member of this committee, shares with Tilden the credit of this work. But the subjects on which he was facile princeps in the convention were those relating to currency and banking, and upon the provisions of the Constitution of 1846, which relate to those subjects, he left a more distinct impression than was left by any of his colleagues. His friend, Mr. C. Cambrelling, who had had a distinguished career of 20 years in Congress, was chairman of the Committee on Banking. Sir Robert Peel had 2 years before carried the famous provision of the Charter of the Bank of England, by which its circulating notes were limited to a fixed minimum, and the excess was supposed to vary according to what would be the fluctuations of a specie currency. This measure was at that time believed by all except a few advanced thinkers, like Tooke, Fullerton, and Lord Ashburton, to afford a perfect protection against future evulsions in business. Mr. Cambrelling was captivated by the theory, and proposed an imitation of it in a provision which required the legislature from time to time to limit the aggregate circulation of the banks. The section was adopted by a vote of 51 to 27. The next day Mr. Tilden moved to reconsider this section, and, after a sharp contest, the motion was carried and the section was stricken out 57 to 41. In this discussion Mr. Tilden made a remarkable speech, which will be found in the Atlas edition of the Debates, page 1001. In that speech will be found the germs of the best modern thought on the subject. There is an interesting allusion to this speech in a letter to the late George Bancroft, written by Mr. Tilden in 1886, the very year of his demise. End of chapter 5, part 1.